Every other company in this industry is asking, how do we make them stop? Nintendo's the only one still asking, how do we make them smile?
And I think that single sentence made me more angry at every other gaming company than any expose I've ever read. Because it's not naive. It's a deliberate business strategy that has outlasted every one of them.
Welcome to Deep Into the Pages.
Today we're spending our time with a really fascinating new book. It's called Super Nintendo, written by Kiza McDonald, and it was just published this year, 2026, by Nuff.
Right. And I want to set the parameters for you, the listener, immediately. Because I know the moment you hear that we are dedicating an entire exploration to Nintendo, there's this immediate temptation to expect some cozy, nostalgic trip down memory lane.
Oh, for sure.
You might be expecting us to, trade stories about blowing dust out of gold Zelda cartridges or getting into shouting matches with our siblings over Mario Kart Blue Shells, and we are absolutely not doing that. This is not a nostalgia piece.
No, not even close. I mean, McDonald has spent 2 decades working as a video games journalist. She's watched these massive technological paradigms shift in real time.
Yeah.
She's covered the dawn of broadband, online multiplayer, the explosion of smartphone microtransactions, the whole desperate cash-running push toward the metaverse.
Yeah.
And now, the current era of these hyper-optimized forever games like Fortnite or Destiny.
Right, the games that just never end.
Exactly. So what we're doing today is looking at her analytical breakdown of literally the most subversive, resilient, and deliberately counterintuitive business philosophy in the modern tech landscape.
And that brings us to the central mystery of the book, which is really what we want to unravel with you today. Because if you consider the wider technology and gaming industry right now, it is entirely defined by an arms race. Right?
100%.
It's just raw computing power and hyper-aggressive revenue extraction. You have these companies pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into single titles, banking everything on cutting-edge graphics. And then they turn around and lay off thousands of developers the moment one of these AAA behemoths underperforms by like a fraction of a percent.
It's a brutal boom and bust cycle. It's exhausting just to watch.
It really is. And yet here is this one company that stubbornly ignores bleeding-edge hardware. They routinely disregard whatever the hottest industry trend happens to be.
Yeah, they just completely sit it out.
They sit it out, and they prioritize this incredibly squishy, seemingly unquantifiable metric of delight over algorithmic monetization. So the question is, how does a company running a playbook that would literally get a Silicon Valley CEO fired out of a cannon outlive every single competitor who chases raw power?
It's a structural anomaly that really demands a proper postmortem. And McDonald argues, quite convincingly, I think, that you cannot understand their current market dominance by just looking at the Nintendo Switch or their modern corporate structure.
No, you have to go way back.
You do. To understand the DNA of this strategy, you actually have to rewind all the way back to the late 1960s. And you have to start at the absolute lowest rung of their corporate ladder.
Right, which means we have to talk about Gunpei Yokoi. And this is such a foundational origin story, because you have to picture the setting here for a second. Nintendo in 1965 is not a tech company.
Not at all.
They were founded way back in 1889 to manufacture Hanafuda playing cards. And for some context, if you aren't familiar, Hanafuda translates to flower cards. They're these traditional Japanese playing cards that don't even have numbers on them.
Right, they use paintings, don't they?
Exactly. They use these intricate paintings of flowers and nature scenes to represent the 12 months of the year. So Nintendo at this time is just running a massive physical manufacturing plant. They're literally just printing cardboard.
Yeah, heavy machinery, ink, loud presses.
Just an industrial factory. And Gunpei Yokoi was not an executive. He wasn't some visionary lead designer with an MBA. He was literally a low-level maintenance worker.
His job was entirely utilitarian. I mean, he had a degree in electronics, but his day-to-day existence was just walking the factory floor, greasing gears, and fixing the mechanical presses that stamped out these Hanafuda cards.
Which sounds incredibly tedious.
Well, it is. If you know anything about industrial maintenance, it consists of these frantic periods of fixing a broken machine, followed by incredibly long stretches of just idle downtime while the machines actually run.
Right.
So Yokoi naturally got intensely bored. And to entertain himself, he started gathering scrap metal, springs, and plastic offcuts from around the factory. Just junk, basically.
Just literal trash from the floor.
Exactly. And he wasn't trying to engineer a consumer product. He wasn't launching a startup. He was just messing around. And he built this crude, mechanical extending claw.
Like a grabber thing.
Yeah, it was this lattice of concertinaed metal that you could squeeze at one end and it would shoot out and grab something at the other end. Just a toy to pass the time.
But then enter the terrifying variable here, which is Hiroshi Yamauchi. Yamauchi was the president of Nintendo at the time, and the book describes him as an absolutely ruthless, militaristic leader.
He was intimidating. Very intimidating.
I mean, he inherited the company at 22 and immediately fired a bunch of his own family members just to consolidate his absolute authority.
Which is a bold move.
It's wild. He ran that factory floor with zero tolerance for nonsense. So Yamauchi is doing an inspection, he's walking the factory floor, and he catches his maintenance guy playing with a scrap metal toy instead of working.
Right, so in any normal corporate environment, Yokoi is fired on the spot, pack up your desk, you're done.
Exactly. But Yamauchi looks at this weird extending contraption, stops, and asks, "Can we sell this?"
It completely disrupts our modern understanding of how research and development is supposed to work. Yamauchi doesn't reprimand him at all. Instead, he orders Yokoi to refine this scrap metal toy for the 1966 Christmas rush.
And they branded it the Ultra Hand, right?
The Ultra Hand, yeah. And it is a massive smash hit. It sells over 1 million units for the holidays. So Yokoi goes from being a bored repairman to being instantly promoted to head up Nintendo's brand new R&D department.
I just have to stop and point out how profoundly backwards this is compared to the modern tech paradigm. I mean, if you look at Google or Meta or Microsoft today, innovation is treated as a function of massive capital.
Oh, billions of dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
You build multi-million-dollar tech incubators. You hire armies of engineers from MIT. You run endless focus groups. You A/B test every possible variable. The underlying assumption is always that innovation requires cutting-edge resources. But here, the innovation came from unconstrained play with actual garbage.
Yeah, it highlights a completely different philosophical approach to corporate creation.
Yeah.
Because the modern tech world, they build this massive infrastructure first, and then they desperately search for a product to justify the spend, you know?
Absolutely.
But Yamauchi created an environment where a spontaneous kernel of actual fun was recognized in the wild,
Yeah.
and then the infrastructure was built around it to scale it up.
But, and I have to push back a little here, I'm going to challenge the premise that this is some grand strategic masterstroke. Because a fun story about a one-off gimmick toy for a 1960s Christmas season doesn't really explain how you build a $100 billion tech empire.
Sure.
I mean, anyone can stumble into a lucky brick with a plastic claw. It doesn't make you a genius.
No, you're right. The toy itself didn't build the empire. But it was the philosophy that Yokoi crystallized from that specific experience. He realized that the success of the Ultra Hand had absolutely nothing to do with advanced engineering.
Right, it was just springs and plastic.
It was just basic physics. And from that realization, he developed Nintendo's core engineering mandate, which he famously called lateral thinking with withered technology.
Okay, wait, withered technology, because that just sounds like a polite corporate translation for obsolete garbage.
It kind of is.
I mean, if I try to sell you a smartphone today and I tell you it's using a processor from 2014, you're going to laugh me out of the room. So how on earth did he convince a boardroom that using old tech was a competitive advantage?
Well, you have to look at the mechanics of the tech industry as a whole. Cutting-edge technology is inherently flawed. It is astronomically expensive to source. The manufacturing yields are usually terrible because the fabrication processes are brand new.
Yeah.
And it's highly unreliable.
Right, it overheats, it breaks.
Exactly.
Right.
And on top of all that, your competitors are all fighting this bloody, expensive war to acquire the exact same components. So Yokoi argued that you step out of that war entirely.
You just don't play the game.
You don't play. You look for withered technology, meaning mature, cheap, widely available components that have been on the market for years. All the bugs have been ironed out and they cost pennies on the dollar.
Okay.
And then you take that boring, perfectly understood technology and you apply lateral thinking. You combine those cheap parts in ways nobody ever anticipated to create an entirely new human experience.
So you aren't inventing new technology. You were just inventing novel applications for discarded technology.
Yes.
And he pushed this idea to an extreme that directly attacks everything we believe about tech hiring today. McDonald points out that he actively argued that designers should not understand cutting-edge technology too well.
Yeah, he preferred to hire industrial designers and artists.
People who literally didn't know how to code or design a circuit board.
Because expertise can actually be a prison. Think about it. If you are a world-class hardware engineer and you know the exact thermal limitations of a microchip, Your brain unconsciously censors your imagination.
Right, you just immediately filter out ideas.
You do. You tell yourself, oh, that feature is computationally impossible, long before you even sketch the idea on a whiteboard. You essentially build a cage of pragmatism around your own creativity.
Wow.
So Yokoi believed that technical ignorance is a massive creative advantage. Because if an artist designs a mechanic that is ridiculously fun simply because they don't know it's supposed to be impossible, they will force the engineers to find a weird lateral workaround to make it happen.
It is so antithetical to the 21st century Silicon Valley obsession with, like, the 10x engineer who knows the absolute bleeding edge limits of code. Nintendo intentionally remained slightly ignorant.
Yeah, beautifully ignorant.
But we need to test this theory against the actual brutality of the free market, right? Because philosophy is great in a book, but does withered technology actually survive against vastly superior hardware when consumers are out there voting with their wallets?
Well, the historical record is pretty definitive here. Let's look at the original Game Boy, which Yokoi himself spearheaded and released in 1989. Competitors like Sega and Atari were entering the handheld market at the exact same time with the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx.
Right, I remember those.
And both of those machines had full-color screens and backlit displays. They were technologically light years ahead of Nintendo. So what does Yokoi put in the Game Boy? A cheap, blurry green and black LCD screen that didn't even have its own light source.
Which was awful. I vividly remember being in the back of my parents' car on road trips, angling the screen under passing street lamps just to see what was happening. It was objectively terrible technology compared to a backlit color display.
And analysts at the time agreed with you. They completely wrote Nintendo off. They assumed consumers would naturally gravitate to the superior color screens.
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't they?
Right.
But Yokoi understood the physics of the situation. Those beautiful color backlit screens required massive amounts of power. The Sega Game Gear devoured 6 AA batteries in about 2 to 3 hours.
Oh my gosh, 6 batteries for 2 hours. That's bankrupting for a kid.
Exactly. But the Game Boy, utilizing that withered low-power tech, could run for 30 hours on 4 batteries. It was cheap to produce, nearly indestructible, and highly portable.
And it absolutely dominated.
It sold 118 million units. It became a global cultural phenomenon, while the technologically superior competitors were commercial failures.
And what's crazy is they repeated that exact playbook constantly. Jump forward to 2004 with the Nintendo DS. Sony releases the PSP, the PlayStation Portable, and that thing is a marvel of engineering. Gorgeous graphics, optical discs. It was essentially a home console in your hands.
It was a beautiful piece of tech.
It really was. And Nintendo answers with the DS, and what do? They use clunky, older, resistive touchscreen technology, like the kind of pressure-sensitive screens used in old 1990s PDAs where you needed a plastic stylus instead of just using your finger.
Right, very dated tech even then.
They slap 2 screens on it, they keep the graphical power incredibly low, and they release it. And again, the industry mocked it as a gimmick, but it went on to sell 154 million units.
Making it the second best-selling console in human history.
Or look at Nintendo Labo in 2018. They literally shipped consumers die-cut sheets of cardboard. You fold the cardboard yourself and slot the Switch controllers into it. The tech press completely scoffed at it, and the market devoured it.
To really crystallize why the market behaves this way, why consumers consistently choose the inferior technology, McDonald introduces a few brilliant cross-domain analogies in the book. And the first one is the Kodak digital camera analogy.
This one blew my mind because it perfectly maps onto the gaming industry. So back in 1975, an engineer at Kodak named Steve Sasson actually invents the very first digital camera.
Right, he builds the prototype.
He builds a prototype using a CCD sensor, but Kodak's executive board completely buries the project. Why? Because their entire monopoly, their entire corporate identity was built on selling physical film rolls and the chemical processing required to develop them.
They were protecting their cash cow.
Exactly. They looked at Sasson's early digital photos, which, to be fair, were only 0.01 megapixels, highly grainy, and required a television screen just to view them, and they dismissed it entirely. They truly believed consumers would always demand the high-resolution, high-megapixel quality of physical film.
But they fundamentally misread human behavior. Kodak assumed the only metric that mattered to a consumer was raw visual fidelity. But a few years later, Japanese electronics companies started flooding the consumer market with cheap digital point-and-shoot cameras using smaller, way less advanced sensors.
Yep.
And they weren't trying to beat Kodak's film on clarity. They were competing on a completely different axis, which was convenience.
Exactly. Because with a digital camera, you could see the photo instantly on a little screen on the back. If you blinked, you could just delete it and take another one right there.
Right, no waiting around.
You didn't have to drive to a pharmacy, drop off a roll, and pay for chemical processing just to find out a week later that your thumb was over the lens the whole time. Kodak failed to realize that consumers value convenience and experience far more than they value raw megapixel perfection.
It's the good enough rule.
Good enough technology that offers a superior, frictionless human experience will almost always defeat superior technology that imposes rigid demands on the user.
And if you translate that back to gaming, that is exactly how Nintendo views the hardware arms race. I mean, Sony and Microsoft are currently locked in this endless teraflop war.
Yeah, let's define that for a second.
Sure, so a teraflop is basically a measurement of a computer's raw mathematical speed. Specifically, its ability to calculate 1 trillion floating point operations per second.
Right.
It is the metric that allows a console to render, hyper-realistic reflections in a puddle or track individual strands of hair blowing in the wind.
The shiny stuff.
The shiny stuff. But Nintendo looked at that and realized something profound. Players do not play math. Players do not interact with teraflops. They interact with an experience.
Which opens up this much deeper, almost philosophical framework in the book. McDonald uses the Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi to explain how Nintendo views graphical fidelity. And we should break down what wabi-sabi actually is, because it's not just a design trend, it's an entire worldview.
It really is. Wabi-sabi is a traditional Japanese aesthetic centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection. It's the idea that true beauty is found in things that are incomplete, impermanent, and rustic.
Right.
It's an appreciation of the natural cycle of growth and decay. So if you're looking at a Japanese garden, wabi-sabi is the moss growing unevenly on a stone or the asymmetrical shape of a weathered tree branch. It's not perfectly manicured.
So apply that to the gaming industry. A modern AAA game with its 4K resolution, ray trace lighting, its billion-dollar budget, and motion-captured Hollywood actors. It is the digital equivalent of a perfect plastic flower.
That's a great way to put it.
It is technically flawless. It will never wilt. Every single petal is engineered to mathematical perfection. But it feels emotionally sterile. There are no gaps left for the viewer's imagination to inhabit. You're just passively observing perfection.
Yeah.
But Nintendo's approach to hardware and software, like the flickery, low-contrast screen of a Game Boy, is like that moss-covered stone.
Because it's limited. And those limitations invite participation from the player. Because the Game Boy couldn't render a photorealistic face, your brain actually had to step in and do the heavy lifting.
You fill in the blanks.
You have to.
Yeah.
The imperfection of the technology requires the player's imagination to bridge the gap between the pixels and the concept. The technology is constrained, but the experience feels alive.
And what's brilliant is how those technical constraints actually become the creative fuel for iconic design. The book uses the creation of Super Mario to illustrate this, and it's fascinating.
Well, I love this example.
We all know what Mario looks like, right? The mustache, the red hat, the blue overalls. But Shigeru Miyamoto didn't just sit down with a blank canvas and say, I think an Italian plumber would be a compelling protagonist. Mario's iconic design was the direct, mandatory result of brutal engineering bottlenecks.
Yeah, when Miyamoto was designing the original Donkey Kong arcade cabinet back in 1981, he had this incredibly tiny grid of pixels to work with. It was an 8x8 pixel canvas to draw the entire character sprite.
Which is nothing.
It's basically a postage stamp. And he wanted the character to have a discernible face. But if you tried to draw a mouth in 8 pixels on a blurry, convex CRT arcade monitor, it just looks like a garbled mess of color bleeding together.
You can't see lips at all.
No. So his solution was to give the character a thick mustache to separate the nose from the chin without needing to render lips.
And he wanted the character's hair to move when he jumped, right? But animating hair required way too much processing power, and it just looked chaotic in low resolution. So he just slapped a red cap on his head. Problem solved.
Exactly.
And when the character ran, his arms would blend into his torso because there weren't enough pixels to define the limbs. The solution. Put him in brightly contrasting overalls so the arms swinging past the body would visually pop. Every single visual element that makes Mario a globally recognizable icon today exists solely because the technology was withered and restrictive.
The limitation literally birthed the icon. If Miyamoto had been given a modern workstation with unlimited polygon counts and photorealistic rendering in 1981, Mario would have just been a generic, proportionally accurate man in work clothes.
We would have forgotten him in a week.
We would have forgotten him decades ago. It proves that boundless resources can actually be the enemy of enduring design.
So if we accept this premise, if we agree that hardware specifications, teraflops, and raw processing power are actually terrible metrics for long-term success, what replaces them? I mean, how do you organize a multi-billion-dollar business if your goal isn't building the fastest machine possible?
You organize around what the book calls experience-first design. And this requires completely inverting the standard pipeline of the technology industry.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that pipeline. In traditional tech, whether you are making a smartphone or a gaming console, the hardware engineers spend 5 years developing the absolute most powerful machine that physics and thermodynamics will allow.
Right, they max out the specs.
They build a powerhouse, finalize the silicon, and then they hand the development kits over to the software designers and say, here is a supercomputer, figure out what to do with it. The hardware dictates the possibilities of the software.
But Nintendo reverses the flow of that river entirely. They determine the desired human experience first.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the designers sit in a room and ask, what is the specific physical or emotional sensation we want a person to feel? And once they have defined that feeling, they work backward. They go to the engineers and say, find us the cheapest, most reliable Withered technology that can deliver this specific sensation.
And the ultimate case study for this has to be the development of the Nintendo Wii under their late president, Satoru Iwata. Iwata is such a fascinating figure. He was a brilliant low-level programmer who actually rose to become CEO, which is incredibly rare in this industry.
Very rare. Usually it's business guys.
Right. And when he took over, the gaming industry was hitting a massive demographic wall. The hardcore gamers were buying consoles, but the general public wasn't. So Iwata asked a devastatingly simple question. Why don't non-gamers play games?
And the rest of the industry's answer to that question was entirely graphical. Sony and Microsoft assumed that games just weren't immersive enough yet.
They thought it was a visual problem.
Exactly. They believed that once games looked indistinguishable from big-budget Hollywood movies, the general public would finally be interested. But Iwata looked at the physical point of contact, which is the controller. If you look at a modern dual analog controller, it has 2 thumbsticks, a directional pad, 4 face buttons, 4 shoulder buttons, and 2 triggers.
It looks like the cockpit of an airplane.
It really does.
If you hand a standard controller to someone who has never played a game before, their immediate physical reaction is stress. They have to look down at their hands to figure out where the X button is. They hold it rigidly. The friction of entry is entirely psychological. Iwata realized that the barrier wasn't graphics. The barrier was fear.
So if the experience you want to design is inclusive, immediate play, how do you build a controller that eliminates fear? You make it look exactly like a television remote. And that became the Wii remote.
So smart.
Why a TV remote? Because universally, across almost all cultures and age demographics, people understand the physical vernacular of a remote control. Whether you are a 7-year-old or an 80-year-old, if I hand you a rectangular wand, your thumb naturally rests on the primary button, and you just know you're supposed to point it at the screen.
And this is where the industry fundamentally misunderstood Nintendo's strategy at the time. I remember hardcore gaming critics accusing Nintendo of dumbing down the medium.
Oh, there was so much backlash.
But taking a complex, intimidating interface and reducing it to an intuitive physical motion isn't dumbing down. It is a masterclass in friction removal. I mean, when I try to get my parents to play a modern shooter, they spend 20 minutes just trying to understand how to move the camera while walking.
Looking at the ceiling, spinning in circles.
Exactly, it's miserable for them. But when I handed them a Wii remote and booted up Wii Bowling, there was no tutorial required. They just swung their arms, the technology vanished, and only the experience remained.
To contextualize why the Wii became such a cultural juggernaut, McDonald pulls in a framework from urban sociology that I found fascinating. Specifically, the concept of the third place, which was coined by sociologist Ray Oldenburg in his 1989 book, The Great Good Place.
Let's talk about the third place, because this is crucial.
So, Oldenburg theorized that for a society to function healthily, human beings require 3 distinct environments. The first place is the home. The second place is work or school. The third place is the community hub, the local pub, the neighborhood coffee shop, the barber shop.
Right.
It is a neutral, egalitarian ground where people gather strictly for the purpose of social interaction and play.
And the genius of the Wii was that Nintendo didn't market it as a high-tech gaming console for teenagers. They marketed it as a living room appliance that functioned as a digital third place. Because before the Wii, the video game console was essentially an isolation tool. It was something a teenager played alone in their bedroom, or at best, something two siblings fought over in the basement away from the parents. But the Wii brought the console into the center of the living room and transformed the couch into a communal hub where grandparents, parents, and children could literally bowl together.
And if you look at their current hardware, the Switch, it is the exact same philosophy evolved.
How so?
Well, the Switch is a third place that you can physically put in your backpack. You can snap off the controllers, prop the screen up on a tiny kickstand at a cafe, and instantly create a social environment anywhere in the world.
That's a great point. And what is most critical to understand about this experience-first philosophy is how directly it opposes the modern monetization models of the rest of the tech sector. Nintendo operates on what we can call a fun-first design ethos. Their primary directive is the creation of delight.
Contrast that with the broader mobile and AAA gaming industry, which has shifted almost entirely to a monetization-first model.
Let's get into the weeds on how sinister that monetization model really is. The book contrasts Nintendo with companies like Zynga, who dominated the early mobile game market. The wider industry has adopted gacha mechanics.
Yeah, the gotcha stuff is everywhere now.
And if you aren't familiar, gacha comes from the Japanese capsule toy vending machines. But in digital terms, it means you pay real money for a random chance to unlock a character or an item. It is, functionally, an unregulated digital slot machine.
It utilizes the exact same psychological hooks as gambling. Specifically, B.F. Skinner's variable ratio reinforcement schedule.
The rat pulling the lever.
Exactly. You don't know when the reward is coming, so you just keep pulling the lever.
Yeah.
Modern games are built entirely around battle passes, daily login bonuses, and exploiting FOMO, the fear of missing out. The entire architecture of the game is engineered not to provide a satisfying arc, but to hack the player's dopamine receptors and keep them perpetually engaged.
They literally refer to players who spend thousands of dollars on microtransactions as whales, adopting the exact terminology of casino operators. Human attention is treated as a natural resource to be aggressively strip-mined.
Which is horrifying.
It is. But Nintendo's continued dominance proves that you do not have to resort to psychological manipulation to be wildly profitable. They prove that if you genuinely prioritize a joyful, complete experience without dark pattern subscriptions, the financial returns follow organically.
Right.
The Switch has sold well over 140 million units because the core experience of playing Mario Kart or Zelda is intrinsically delightful, not because an algorithm tricked the player into opening a daily loot box.
Okay, I agree with the premise of that success.
Yeah.
I really do. However, we have spent 40 minutes outlining this philosophy, and frankly, it sounds a little utopian.
It does sound a bit perfect, yeah.
McDonald's book is highly complimentary, but we have to interrogate the dark side of experience-first design. Because when you are utterly obsessed with curating a specific user experience, there's a very fine line between quality control and outright authoritarianism.
I am so glad we are pivoting to this because as much as I admire their hardware philosophy, I have major issues with the "we just want to make you smile" narrative when you look at their legal behavior.
Right, the legal stuff is intense.
Let's look at the facts here. Nintendo is notoriously aggressively hostile to its own fan base. If a community of passionate fans decides to run a grassroots Super Smash Bros. Tournament, and they use a modified version of an old game to make it playable over the internet, like the Slippy mod for Melee, Nintendo's lawyers will swoop in and shut the entire tournament down days before it happens.
They absolutely will.
If a fan spends 10 years of their life coding a loving tribute remake of an old Metroid game, like the AM2R project, Nintendo issues a brutal cease and desist order the very day it launches. They sue websites hosting decades-old ROM files into absolute financial ruin. So my question is, if this company's North Star is truly joy, why do they treat their most dedicated creative fans like a disease they need to eradicate?
It is a harsh reality, but I will defend their logic here. Because their legal aggression is actually the exact same experience-first philosophy operating in a different arena.
How does suing a fan equal experience first?
Well, you're viewing their lawsuits as standard corporate greed, but from Nintendo's internal perspective, it's the rigorous protection of the user experience. Consider the time and capital they invest in their IP. They will delay a Mario game for years, absorbing massive financial hits just to ensure the physics of his jump feel absolutely perfect. They do that to build an implicit contract of trust with the consumer.
Right, but shutting down a fan tournament doesn't break that trust.
To them, it does. If they turn a blind eye and allow anybody to release a half-broken, glitchy fan-made Mario game, or if they permit third parties to run poorly organized, chaotic tournaments under the Smash Bros. Banner, the fundamental meaning of what Nintendo represents to a casual observer becomes diluted.
I mean, I guess.
If a parent downloads a fan-made Pokemon game for their kid and it's full of bugs or inappropriate content, that parent blames Nintendo. They are tending a walled garden. And the brutal truth of gardening is that if you want the roses to thrive, you have to be absolutely ruthless about pulling up the weeds, even if those weeds were planted with good intentions.
Okay, I understand the mechanics of brand protection. But here's the problem with that defense. Brand dilution was a valid excuse in 1985 when they were trying to save the industry from the Atari crash. We are talking about a book published in 2026. The cultural paradigm has completely shifted.
You're talking about user generation.
Yes. User-generated content, or UGC, is the lifeblood of modern digital culture. Look at the biggest games on the planet right now. Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite. These are generational ecosystems built entirely on handing the tools of creation over to the community. They let the players build the world.
They do, yeah.
In an era where collaboration and open-source creativity are celebrated globally, Nintendo's insistence on being a closed, authoritarian dictator over their IP feels like a massive liability. Isn't their refusal to let the community and a catastrophic failure to adapt to modern media consumption?
It looks like a failure to adapt only if you completely ignore the collateral damage of the UGC model.
Collateral damage.
Yes. You hold up Roblox and Fortnite as the gold standard, but let's look at the reality of open UGC platforms. For every brilliant community-built masterpiece, there is a vast, toxic ocean of low-quality, exploitative content. The UGC model inherently creates a race to the bottom.
It definitely gets messy, sure.
It incentivizes creators to hack the algorithm, use clickbait, and implement predatory monetization just to stand out in all that noise. I mean, there have been massive controversies about UGC platforms effectively utilizing digital child labor by incentivizing kids to build games for pennies on the dollar.
I concede that UGC platforms have massive moderation issues. That's a fair point.
Exactly. And Nintendo simply refuses to participate in that race to the bottom. Their strict authoritarian control is precisely why a game like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe can sell tens of millions of copies at full retail price, more than a decade after it was originally released.
Because it's a known quantity.
Because the walled garden guarantees a baseline of trust. When a parent buys a Nintendo product, they know with absolute certainty that it is safe, polished, and functionally whole. A platform like Roblox, by its very decentralized nature, can never offer that guarantee.
Yeah.
In Nintendo's eyes, the control is the product.
Fine, the curation argument holds water. I'll give you that. But let's attack the entire premise of McDonald's praise for a second. The book frames lateral thinking with withered technology as this nearly infallible design philosophy. But it conveniently glides over the catastrophic failures.
You're bringing up the Wii U.
I have to rank the Wii U. The book mentions it, but let's look at the numbers. The Wii U sold barely 13 million units in its entire lifetime. In the home console market, that is an unmitigated disaster.
A massive flop.
The hardware was a mess. It relied on this massive, clunky tablet controller with terrible battery life. The asymmetric gameplay confused consumers, and the processor was fundamentally bottlenecked. Was the gamepad really a brilliant example of lateral thinking, or was it just a confused, expensive piece of plastic that nobody wanted?
Well,
Are we and the author just suffering from survivorship bias? We write books praising their weird hardware gambles when they work out, and we make intellectual excuses for them when they fail spectacularly.
the Wii U was a profound commercial failure. There's absolutely no debating that. But I would counter that how Nintendo handled the failure of the Wii U actually validates their overarching philosophy rather than exposing it as a fluke.
How does a failure validate the strategy?
You have to look at their corporate structure. Nintendo operates with a famously massive war chest of cash reserves. They retain billions of dollars in liquid assets for exactly this scenario.
Right.
Think about how a traditional tech company reacts to a failure of that magnitude. If Google or Microsoft launches hardware that flaps that hard, They immediately kill the division, lay off 5,000 employees, and aggressively pivot their other software to microtransactions just to appease shareholder panic for the next fiscal quarter.
They enter a complete death spiral of cost-cutting.
Right. But because Nintendo has structured themselves to be financially insulated from shareholder panic, they can afford to fail on a massive scale without compromising their identity. They didn't panic. They didn't suddenly put loot boxes in Mario to make up the difference.
They just absorb the hit.
They absorbed it, and they accepted the Wii U as the necessary evolutionary misstep required to invent their next product. The Nintendo Switch is literally just the perfected, refined version of the Wii U's core concept, which was taking a home console experience away from the television.
That's true. It is the same core idea.
The Wii U's failure was just the extremely expensive R&D required to figure out the Tegra mobile chip architecture that made the Switch possible. Their financial conservatism buys them the freedom to make a 13 million unit mistake so they can learn how to make a 140 million unit masterpiece.
That is a very compelling way to reframe it. The cash reserves essentially act as a shield to protect the design philosophy from the winds of the stock market.
Exactly.
So let's bring this down from the macro business level to the micro personal level, because understanding this incredibly specific corporate philosophy actually changed the way I think about my own media consumption.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll be vulnerable here. After reading McDonald's breakdown, I realized I have been playing video games wrong for my entire adult life.
I'm curious what you mean by wrong.
Well, I have spent the last 15 years chasing the illusion of more. I bought the expensive graphics cards. I sought out games boasting massive 100-hour completionist checklists. I wanted open worlds so big you couldn't see the edges, and dynamic weather systems that tracked individual raindrops.
Right, the endless pursuit of realism.
Yes. But when I actually stepped back and analyzed my own behavior, when I looked at the games I actually returned to week after week, year after year to decompress, they are the ones with the most restrictive rules and the simplest presentation.
The withered tech.
Exactly. It's Tetris. It's Mario Kart. It's perfectly constrained mechanics. The book made me realize I was confusing technological scale with emotional resonance. I don't need a game to simulate a one-to-one scale replica of a galaxy. I just need it to give me a perfectly polished, deeply satisfying core loop.
That makes total sense.
Understanding their philosophy completely shifted my perspective from constantly desiring more to actually appreciating better.
That resonates with me completely. For me, the personal takeaway that fundamentally shifted my perspective wasn't about the hardware. It was a specific story in the book about the creation of the original Animal Crossing.
Oh, I loved that part.
If you look at the creator, Katsuya Iguchi, his motivation for designing the game is staggering in its simplicity. He didn't sit down and try to engineer a life simulator with the goal of maximizing daily active users or driving engagement metrics.
No, not at all.
He designed the game because he was a young father. He was working grueling, isolated, late-night hours at the Nintendo development offices in Kyoto, and he was profoundly lonely.
The emotional core of the game was just his personal isolation.
Exactly. He wanted to build a shared digital town operating on an asynchronous clock where he could leave a digital letter or a piece of virtual furniture for his kids to find when they played the game during the day.
Wow.
He just wanted a way for his family to feel his presence in a shared space, even when he was physically stuck at work.
When you look at the modern tech landscape, that is the least ambitious design brief imaginable. I miss my kids, so I'm going to code a digital bulletin board. There is no pitch deck for exponential growth in that idea.
But that is the point. 20 years later, that specific, tiny kernel of human vulnerability, that simple desire for a gentle, low-stakes connection, is what organically scaled into Animal Crossing. New Horizons.
Right.
And that is the game that literally kept millions of people tethered to their sanity during the global lockdowns of 2020. People held virtual weddings and graduations in a game built by a lonely dad in the early 2000s.
It's incredible to think about it that way.
It poses a massive, convicting reflection for us today. What would the modern technology landscape look like if products were actually built to solve someone's acute personal loneliness instead of being precision engineered to exploit their dopamine and fracture their attention span?
That thought brings this entire conversation full circle. At the very beginning of this discussion, we talked about how every other company in the tech industry asks, how do we make them stop? Well, Nintendo's the only one asking, how do we make them smile?
Yeah.
And after spending all this time unpacking the mechanics of withered technology, the sociology of the third place, and the sheer hostility required to protect a walled garden, I hope it's clear that the opening quote is not just a cute compliment.
It's not.
It is a damning indictment of the wider tech industry's failure of imagination. Making them stop is engagement optimization. It is viewing human attention as a raw material to be extracted by algorithms. Making them smile cannot be optimized by an algorithm.
Right.
It requires genuine vernacular craftsmanship. It requires building the digital equivalent of a Japanese garden with all the imperfect, moss-covered stones that entails.
Which leaves all of you listening with one final provocative thought to mull over. We have spent this time analyzing how a Japanese corporation applies this philosophy to toys and software. But what would happen if you applied that core mandate to your own work?
In whatever field you're in.
Exactly. When you are building a project, writing a presentation, designing a workflow, or creating any kind of experience for another human being, what if you stopped asking the industry standard question of, how do I optimize this for maximum efficiency?
And started asking.
And started asking, how do I build this to bring someone genuine joy? And more importantly, what would your work look like if you actually took the answer to that question seriously?
That's it for this episode of Deep Into the Pages.